Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm incredibly excited for this webinar. It's entitled How Customers Think, Feel and Act, the Paradigm of Business Outcomes. Now, one of the reasons I'm so excited is to have our guest speaker, Dipanjan Chatterjee. He is going to introduce himself. He's a VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and he's going to be taking us through some results from a recently commissioned, Focus Vision commissioned a Forrester study that he's going to be sharing the results for. Dipanjan, would you like to give a brief introduction to yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Zoe, and wonderful to be here, and I'm great that all of you could make it. As Zoe mentioned, I am a Vice President in Forrester Research, and the focus of my work is brand strategy, and in some capacity, I would say over the last 2 decades, I've been working on brand and marketing strategy, both, of course, in Forrester, but also in a variety of product and marketing organizations, and also a variety of strategy consulting firms. So, hopefully we will bring all of that experience to bear today, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Great, thank you very much. And for anybody that doesn't know me, my name's Zoe Dowling. I'm SVP of Research here at Focus Vision. And before we get to hear the results of the Forrester study commissioned by Focus Vision, just a brief background on Focus Vision. You might not know who we are. We are part of the Experience Insights technology market. So that is, we offer technology solutions to help you get close to your customers. And by that, it might be through a survey, through online focus groups or interviews or online research communities. So we offer lots of different ways to help you get closer to your customer through customer insights. Now, why are we here today, and what was the genesis of this Forrester research that we commissioned? Well, we believe at Focus Vision that great customer experiences begin with understanding your customer truths. And what does this mean? It means that understanding them holistically. It means getting close to how they think, feel, and act to really understand what's going on in their lives and how your brand, your product, your services play out with them. And so rather than just sitting around thinking about this, we and saying this is what we believe, we wanted to try and understand, how did this play out in the real world? And so we commissioned Forrester to undertake an independent study exploring the topic from 2 sides. Firstly, the motivations underlying consumer decision-making, and secondly, from the brand side, to gain insight into how companies seek to understand their customers and what key challenges hold them back. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Dipanjan to take you through some of the key findings from the study. And, with that, Dipanjan, please take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zoe. So think, feel, and act. It sounds mysterious, but we are hoping that by the end of this session, you will have a clear idea of why those 3 words are absolutely critically important in how you build brands. So let's get moving with the material. I am going to sort of take you through a bunch of slides that hopefully will make it very clear why a customer understanding at that level of complexity is going to help you tremendously in understanding your customer and inducing them to act on your behalf. Now, that said, I think all of us have a very good sense deep in our guts what it is that we want to do with our customers, right? So we'll talk in a little bit about the work that Forrester and Focus Vision did together. But in the work, what we found was that 91% of the firms that we talked to agreed that customers want a convenient and, of course, a highly personalized experience, right? A tremendous challenge today is for brands to find relevance in a sea of distraction. And unless a brand has an offering that caters to the personal needs and wants of the customer, it's simply going to get lost in the noise. We also found that 93% of firms agree that customers are likely to spend more money with a brand that they feel connected to. Again, this should be no surprise. The whole notion of branding is to find meaning beyond utility, right? So as a consumer, as a customer, the moment you feel that deeper connection with the brand, you are much more likely to favor it over others. Now, that said, we sometimes are a little bit too over optimistic about our ability to deliver on these. There's the old sort of research anecdote that says, I think about some 70% of people believe that they are better looking than average, right? Now, that clearly is not possible. We found that 81% believe that their brand differentiates them from the competition. Now, in theory, while that may be true, we know that it isn't. If you look at most categories around you, they are heavily commoditized. I mean, if anything, I would venture to say that it's probably about 20% of brands that truly are differentiated from the others, right? But there is a way to get to differentiation, right? There is a way to build the kind of personalization, the connection that we talked about. And it is indeed a worthwhile endeavor. Because if you can do it right, there's a lot to be gained, right? So on the slide that you see, what we found that people who believe they've had a memorable experience with a brand likely to pay a higher price, a premium price for that brand. And that's one of the greatest characteristics, assets, if you will, of a strong brand. Because what it does is it builds in price inelasticity. And that's a great position for a differentiated brand to have, to really separate itself from its commoditized category.
So Dipanjan, if I can just interject there, I think that's a really
Sure.
interesting point. And I think that's where brands all want to be, get at the point where their customers will feel that they'll pay more for their products or services. What other benefits accrue from brands getting it right?
Look, Zoe, you get benefits up and down the traditional customer funnel. Everything from improving consideration, driving preference, enhancing the likelihood to buy, ensuring that people come back to you, really encouraging people to be brand advocates, which not only drives retention, but it actually loops back to the top of the funnel and it drives acquisition, because we know nowadays that what the brand says really doesn't count for that much. What really counts is what your friends and family are saying, right? So the benefits that accrue to a brand work across the funnel. The price piece is an interesting and an important one, because it gives you a sense of how directly brand is connected to value. If you can sustain that premium, if you can build in that inelasticity, you are directly boosting the top line and the bottom line for the particular brand. So, just an embarrassment of riches come from having this kind of connection.
That makes a lot of sense, because it's not just about getting people to pay more on that individual purchase. It's about building that relationship with them and having a sustained relationship where they also feel connected to you and advocate for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the question then becomes, how do we get there? And I think, as a discipline, we have evolved. So the classic approach to this has always been about awareness. We've had this framework of AIDA, awareness, interest, and so on and so forth for probably 2 centuries now, right? And the whole idea was, look, you have a mass of people out there. How do I make them aware of my product or my service? And then we sort of moved on from there, and we built on top of it. And we had kind of the classic CPG style brand management from, the Procter and Gambles and the Unilevers. We had sort of the 4 P's of product and price and so on that you're taught in every business school, which really beefed up the strategic component of marketing. Now that still didn't, take us all the way there, because the third evolution of brand marketing really started talking about the human being at the center of the decision, right? So the brand management approach was always sort of inside out. I have something to sell you. How do I define it? How do I price it? What's my channel strategy? The third version that you see, and on your screens, you essentially see what is a brain, which is kind of the work that stems from folks like Daniel Kahneman, who is the first psychologist to have won a Nobel Prize in economics. So essentially what Kahneman says, and I'll make a very, very long story short for you, is that evolution has wired our brains to conserve energy, right? So this is really, in some ways, the theory of the lazy brain. We have been programmed by evolution to prefer quicker, emotional, more impulsive pathways. That's how we make decisions. We don't go through sort of laborious contortions of rational decision making. So what this means for brands is that if you are on that fast track, then you stand to benefit, because that's how we as consumers make decisions. And that fast track is all about emotional activation. Now, this sounds all theoretical, and trust me, there is an abundance of theory behind this. But then again, as we saw in the data from our survey, all of the marketers have a gut sense that tells them that this is right. So, when we ask people, hey, if you were better able to understand how customers think and feel, how likely is it that your brand or your organization would be better at winning new customers, innovating, better engagement? You see numbers from 72 to 88%. So for the most part, everyone knows that if they can get better at being able to comprehend the thought process, the decision process of consumers, they would stand to do better as a brand. That's the good news. But unfortunately, there is bad news to go with it, right? This is a tough nut to crack. Only 38% of firms strongly agree that they actually know why one customer chooses to buy from their brand while another doesn't. So while there is recognition that this is super important, there is almost a despondency about not knowing what to do about it. So what we have for you is a going in hypothesis. We want to sort of paint for you a certain view of consumer behavior, of branding and marketing, that we believe is going to be effective in getting firms to really crack that nut. So the way we think about it is this closed loop between act, feel, and think. Right. So at the top of all of this, every marketer at some point of time, sometimes far too frequently, is questioned on their ability to generate value for the organization. Value comes from people acting, right? So your customers, your consumers, buy something, they renew something, they pay more, and so on and so forth, right? What drives these actions? The underlying system that provokes this action is based on people's feelings and how they think about things. If brands can explore, can demystify, can understand the underlying drivers of thoughts and feelings, then they stand an advantage in provoking the action that in turn then connects to value. So this is sort of the hypothesis. We're going to talk about this, and we are going to gauge whether this really holds up or not. And just as an aside, a lot of the data that has to do with this comes from the work we've done with a group of consumers, surveys, as also with business leaders in sort of the marketing and the insights functions. So let's talk about the way that customers think and feel and how that drives income. So what it drives outcomes, excuse me, income being a large part of that. So what we did was we set out a group of tranches, if you will, from the consumer funnel that are directly linked to value creation, right? So if you think about actually buying something, remaining loyal, coming back and repurchasing, enhancing your relationship. Advocacy. Advocacy is sort of a double whammy there, because not only is it more purchase from the customer who's an advocate, as we talked about, there is acquisition coming at the top of the funnel from other people who are being introduced to it. So what we tried to test through a sophisticated analytical framework is, our thoughts and feelings connected to this. And just to give you a sense of what on earth sort of think and feel really mean here. When we talk about feel, we talk about underlying emotions, right? So we quiz our respondents on whether they felt delighted, relaxed, surprised, etc. So we are testing a variety of emotions and their activation. That's what feel is. Think is how people think of the brand, their perceptions, and a lot of that is perceived emotional and rational benefits. So first and foremost, we found that both think and feel are statistically significant drivers of business outcomes. We were keeping our fingers crossed as we were running the analysis, and it turned out exactly the way we were hoping it would. Makes complete sense. The impact of feel was about 1.5 times of the think impact. And the reason for that is the feel component of it is more visceral. It underlies the thinking. So once we feel a certain way, it informs the process of how we think and how we calculate the rational and the emotional benefits. So again, it's no surprise that the feel component of it came out stronger.
Panjan, I think that this was something that was not necessarily surprising to see, I think, but it was definitely had a lot of impact. Seeing that feel has 1.5 times the impact of think. Have you seen similar results in other work that you've done around sort of how feel plays, the emotions play with brand outcomes, business outcomes?
Yes, for sure. I mean, if you the slide that we showed you on the evolution of branding that had Daniel Kahneman on it, there are mountains and mountains of sort of academic work around the importance of emotions. And, I would say it precipitated this huge surge in behavioral economics, and folks like, Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize, I think, a couple of years or maybe last year in economics. But separate from the academic work, there's been a whole bunch of work at a lot of sort of leading firms to demonstrate this. We have done work at Forrester around this as well. And I developed something at Forrester called the Brand Energy Framework. And essentially what we found was that if you think of the energy of a brand in its ability to induce you to act on its behalf, about 50% of that energy stems from emotional activation. So now that's just one example, but this is unanimous. There's ample evidence that we have really sort of moved on from that inside-out world of branding and marketing to one that recognizes that emotions are really a key driver of choice.
Oh, that's great.
So talking about emotions, we sort of looked a little bit deeper to see what kinds of emotions, what kind of emotional benefits were surfacing to the top as we looked at what it was that made brands successful in terms of activating the purchasing funnel, the advocacy funnel, and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to share with you the first set of findings here, where you see kind of 3 emotional clusters surface. So you see kind of a grouping around a brand being trustworthy. You see a second grouping around a value, and a third around reliability. And again, similar to sort of what I just mentioned to Zoe, these are clusters that you've seen come up in other studies as well. I think trust becomes especially important nowadays because over the last 2 decades, you've seen a significant decline of trust, particularly in institutions and particularly in big brands that resemble institutions. On the flip side, you see emerging insurgent brands, typically direct-to-consumer brands, that have been imbued with a much greater feeling of trust. So 3 emotions to keep in mind, as you go about your work in your categories, there might be certain sort of tweaks to this, certain specificities you need to worry about. So really, when you put things like this into action for yourself, you kind of need to run the numbers for yourself. But if you find that what you come up with is similar to this, then you shouldn't be surprised, because these are very broad cross-category emotions that come into play. So we talked about what works. Now we talk about how do we get it to work, right? So how do organizations inform their understanding of consumer behavior? And what we were trying to understand was the distribution of their use of big data and small data to inform their experience strategy. You see a bit of kind of the definitional aspects of big data and the small data on the left-hand panel, but this is probably what you would expect. Now, what you find here is that almost 60% of folks lean on big data to inform their customer experience strategy. It is a high number, right? And I think again, it's something that in some sense we perhaps expected to see, but it has significant implications for what we are finding, how we can make it actionable, and where we go from there. So if 56% of these folks are relying on big data to some extent, or to a large extent, what could go wrong? Well, quite a bit, right? So we've just spent a lot of time talking about thoughts and feelings, and the criticality of understanding those as drivers of choice, right? A lot of big data is around revealed transactions. If you are going to collect a lot of scanner data and merge it with sort of clickstream data and so on and so forth, where are the thoughts and feelings, right? So we clearly do not have enough in there to be able to distill out of it enough valuable insight about consumer choice. So that's the first problem. The second problem, there is a lack of accountability when you use big data to run big analytics, right? I mean, these are very, very sophisticated systems and algorithms. When they work, that's absolutely fantastic, right? So if you can use big data and big analytics to identify the winner of the Kentucky Derby, or to diagnose certain diseases that physicians can't, great. When it doesn't work, you are stuck, right? The big data and analytics paired up are good for predictions, but they're not great for explaining the prediction. So if your prediction is off, then you can never work your way backwards and say, let me try and understand what went on, right? What is going on with the components of my model that might be wrong? So it is a black box, take it or leave it. And if you have to leave it, you really have no recourse to anything useful. And then the third piece is something called the curse of dimensionality. And essentially what it says is, hey, if you throw enough variables into the model, a sheer chance something significant will pop up, right? and it actually will not be significant, right? So in the construction of the data and the model, there is a risk that something will go wrong. Again, as I said, these are very, very sophisticated things. And sometimes there's an implicit assumption that we have set them all up perfectly, that there is no shortcoming in the way that we are executing on them. And that is not always true. If something goes wrong, then the worst case scenario is you won't even know it's gone wrong, and it has gone wrong, right? Best case scenario, you know it's gone wrong, but you don't really know how to fix it. So these are sort of significant problems that you can get into using big data. The use of big data also has some interesting implications in terms of how organizational departments and functions line up. So this is, one of the most surprising insights that I gathered from this work. And what we were trying to understand is, within an organization, who should be leading the effort to better understand how customers think and feel. Now, as you can see here, the winner in this race is the information technology group, followed by customer insights and marketing. 38% of our respondents said that IT should be responsible for leading the effort on how customers think and feel. Now, I will tell you, in hundreds of brands I have worked with, I have never seen IT lead this particular responsibility. And I think what's happened is that the complexity of big data is such that really it's fallen within the purview of the technology group. It's when you collect the data, there is such a great disconnect from the actual meaning of what transpires in a brand-customer relationship. The channels are so many, the formats are so complex and so many, that essentially all the traditional functions that shepherded the entire brand and marketing and customer process say, hey, this is something that IT needs to handle, right? So in not necessarily the best place to be in terms of the sole ownership and the steward of this program, certainly a very, very important function in the mix. But what you see is in organizations where there's a preponderance of big data, it just gives rise to some very strange and probably highly inefficient organizational lines. All right, here's another problem. This is equally serious. So when we try to understand the interaction between insights and marketing, what we found was 54% said that insights and marketing regularly communicate with one another, right? Now, this number needs to be as close to 100 as possible, right? Traditionally, in most organizations, the CMO owns the customer. The insights function is the richest, the most potent source of information about the customer. There are chances that marketing might be doing a few other things, but the insights function should be devoting all of its attention to ensuring that marketing is fully aware of what's going on with the customer. 54 is far too low. And if 54% was too low, then you look over and say, only 38% say they regularly share data with one another in formats that the other can understand and use. The rest of it, no one can understand, and it's useless, right? Again, the nature of the information, the data that is being collected, the multiplicity of formats, the complexity, really introduces some significant wedges between these different departments and functions. Now, that said, I think organizations and folks in these organizations realize that all is not right. So what we found is, roughly half of our respondents said that, look, small data is better than big data at helping brands understand the thoughts and emotions. They said, hey, we don't have enough small data insights on our customers. So, it's not that people don't understand it. I think people realize that the small data component will be more effective, that they don't have enough of it. But they still need to figure out what it is they need to do to access all of that information, and they need to figure out how to put it to use.
I think this is an interesting point, Panjan, around and everything up to this has been fascinating as well. But getting to this point around sort of where small data and the sense of the lack of it, could you give us any examples where you found that small data has made a big difference, that maybe could encourage people to think about collecting more of it and using more of it? It's not just about collecting it.
Yeah, absolutely. To give you an example, there are plenty of brands like Lego, like Adidas, like Samsung, a lot of CPG brands. I mean, I live a few miles away from P&G's world headquarters. They have significant groups of sort of anthropologists, social scientists on staff, to really better understand the context of decision making. I mean, imagine how much big data P&G has, how much retailer data it pulls in, interaction data, social data. Yet it believes that it needs that context that comes from better understanding how it is their consumers are making decisions, what the underlying thoughts and feelings are. Yeah, and I'll give you an example of Gatorade, right? For a while, they were struggling because the market had really flattened on their hydration drinks, and they didn't know what to do. They crunched all the numbers, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel. But there was a group within Gatorade who sort of spent time with people who consumed Gatorade and tried to understand what they did. And there's a famous story of the Gatorade folks tracking Usain Bolt, the runner. And what they would find is, sure, he would have Gatorade when he was supposed to have Gatorade. But before he started running, he would just, have a whole bunch of Skittles. And then after he got done running, he would have smoothies and things like that. And Gatorade said, hey, we've been consumed by thinking about how our customers interact with Gatorade. How about how they interact with everything else around the Gatorade occasions? So they found, for example, taking the Skittles example, that it made sense for Gatorade to enter markets like chews and other sort of food products that were related to what they were doing. I mean, the point here is, if you looked at a bunch of big data, that wasn't going to lead you there. But if you spend a little bit of time to understand the context in which your products and your services are being used, it can really open up significant opportunity and provide really wonderful insights into what works for the customer.
I think that's a great example around just, like you said, the context. It's not just asking the question, how often are you drinking, in this case, Gatorade or whatever it may be, or eating XYZ, but figuring out, well, what else is going on around it, and what else are you doing? What else is part of your routine? So just, it's a great illustration of going beyond the sort of the immediate questions and answers that you're seeking to find to understand it a bit more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me show you a couple of slides that actually demonstrates that folks do believe that small data is more potent. So, for example, 41% of small data users versus 31% of big data users believe they have a better handle on customer choice. So that's the bar graph on your right. The green are the folks who use small data. The black are folks who are not using small data. So you see the small data users have just better insight on customer choice. The next slide is very similar. it says, 42% of the small data users versus 26% of the big data users say that, look, our marketing and our CI, our insights team regularly share data with one another, and they share it in formats that make sense to us, that we understand and that we can use. So there is there is a case to be made outside of even anecdotes, in the belief that if you are a small data user, then you are doing things that are right, and you are really sort of enhancing your understanding of the customer. So I know you don't want to spend all day sitting and listening to me. So it's probably time that I wrap up, and I'm going to leave you with a few key takeaways here, right? So the first thing here is we have to move from an inside out product service orientation to one that's outside in and customer obsessed. As a discipline, that's what we've done. We kind of talked about moving from awareness to brand management to really sort of a human driven branding. And in order to really understand thoughts and feelings as drivers of action and business value, we need to flip the lens from inside out to outside in. To do that, we need to think not just of interaction, but to perception. I mean, we just talked about plenty of examples where you can gather a lot of data about what people did, but it's not going to tell you a whole lot about why. And to understand the why, you need to understand the perception aspect of it. 3, you need to move from data proliferation to texture, right? There is a whole lot of data out there. You could use as little or as much, and you could go insane trying to comprehend all of it, right? What you really need to do is prioritize the data that's important and then add context. We just talked about kind of Gatorade into context. You need to add the context. You need to add the human insight to add some texture to that data. If you don't, then you simply will be left with a lot of interactions without really knowing what it is that really moves your consumers. The Latin root for the word emotion has to do with movement. So what you're trying to do is really activate emotions to move your customers towards you. And then finally, to do all of this right, you need to move from a siloed to a connected organization. There are too many parts of the organization involved today. I mean, we saw how IT popped up in a very interesting way, right? IT is a crucial element of your customer understanding strategy, right? Insights, I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? So these parts of the organization need to move in lockstep, and they need to do so right from the beginning. It's not something, it's a, hey, we will reach out to them when we need to. The world is run by sort of data and the insights that we capture from it, from kind of an IT standpoint, right? Perhaps they could play a role in shaping how you think about gathering data. Where we tend to talk about sort of data, but we need to talk in a little bit more detail and granularity about what is the right data to capture. How do we keep it, and how do we connect it to other pieces of data? How do we translate all of that into insights and into experiences that actually affect the customer? So, as you ask these kinds of questions, if you also ask yourselves, what sort of functions in my organization might be involved in answering or addressing these questions, you have a rich group of departments. And what I'm telling you is that these folks need to be involved right from the moment you start asking the questions, right from the beginning. So that is one of the most important aspects of all of this. So Zoe, that's all that I have for you. Any questions? Did something strike you as sort of interesting, or something to talk about further?
So many things, and I'm sure everybody on the line with us will agree that there was a lot of things in there. I was just thinking about it in terms of it's interesting that we know, and we do know, I mean, emotions have been talked about for a while now, and yet it's not just as simple, it's not just as straightforward as understanding sort of your emotions. There's another lot of different factors that come into it. And just to go into that last point that you're talking about around departmental silos, when you are collecting that small data to really help you understand how your customers think, feel, and act, that data isn't always going and being shared and leveraged in ways that could really benefit the organization. I think that was one of the things that just kind of stood out to me right now as you were wrapping up.
Yeah.
I'm going to say to people, I'm sure people on the line have questions. I've seen a couple of in, so I would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to wrap up on the Focus Vision side with a brief case study that actually is not entirely dissimilar to the one, Dipanjan, that you told about Gatorade, and how actually just understanding the context around what people were doing in that scenario in terms of consuming the Gatorade drink, and what other things were they doing, and rituals and routines. So this case study here was actually around makeup and the role of cosmetics. And Avon wanted to explore the meaning of cosmetics in women's lives, and actually in particular, Latin American women based in South America. It was like, so what is the emotional impact of cosmetics for these women? And specifically, they wanted to understand, how does it fit into their lives? What emotional roles does it play for them? Does it play any? And what does the average beauty bag look like? And so those are a few of the ingoing research questions that were asked. Now, to answer this, they actually took a two-pronged approach. And I think that this one is actually important around, Dipanjan, you talked about getting textured insights coming out. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to do that. And that's something that I would certainly want to stress to people is, we can get an awful lot from a survey. And for this one, a very large survey was undertaken. It was 3,800 interviews conducted in 4 countries, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. And I really wanted to dig into the types and the number of products that they used, what was in the beauty bags, tried to get to loyalty drivers, brands used, and overall brand perceptions. This was then paired with an online diary, a qualitative research community, and that, I think, added some richness, which we'll see. Now, I've just done a few excerpts from the study here, just to give a flavor of what was found. So from the quantitative piece, it was found that, whilst, as one would understand, taking care of children came up as a top priority within the women's lives, taking care of themselves was also part of this. It's also an extremely important aspect of their life. So around 2/3 said this was the case of where, and you can see how it fits in along with other areas of their lives. Now, it was also found that this was taking care of themselves around 2 different spheres, that around sort of a really balanced life and health. So that could be around drinking lots of water, eating healthy, good diet, exercise, taking time to do those things. But there was also the beauty routine aspect of it, and actually using makeup products and using skincare products. Now, you might remember that one of the objectives of the study was to really kind of to understand the sizes and what's the makeup, if you'll excuse the pun, I think, of the cosmetics bags. And for me, this is one of the fascinating findings, that there was actually 5 different sizes, roughly speaking, of beauty bags, ranging from extra large of around 100 items or more to extra smalls of 12 items. I definitely fall in that lower end of the spectrum on extra small. So it was, again, fascinating to see that there are these different types of sizes of beauty bags. And you can also see here just the makeup of it, what different elements were fitting in it, from a variety of lipsticks and eyeshadows through to the mascaras and foundations. So this was an interesting piece that was got through the quantitative investigation. The real richness, I think the context and the texture that was added was within the online research community, the mobile diary, that actually had a sub-selection of the women, really delve into some of their routines to try and get a little bit more about those emotional connections. But it also provides context, it brings it to life for the people sitting back and in the office, it's like, well, what do these beauty bags, as we've got here, actually look like? And so getting these images of from the extra large to the extra small, what does it look like? What are the products in there? Some of the other activities that women completed was actually recording a video of them going through their morning beauty routine, starting from sort of everything from washing faces and so on to applying the different layers of makeup. And that just provides a lot of insights and richness. And I mean, video data is fantastic for really providing that context and making something very real and human and personal to this is what's going on within their lives. So that was really just a snapshot of how, small example of how using, not just collecting small data in the forms of surveys and so on, but also going different ways, using online research communities, online focus groups, interviewing to get more of that richness through. So I would certainly encourage you to, if you're interested, to read the Forrester study that we commissioned, that Focus Vision commissioned, to learn more about this Avon study that I gave a brief outline of, or certainly to view other examples of how we at Focus Vision have helped our clients. Please do visit our resource library. And with that, though, I'm delighted to open it up to questions. And I see we've got a number coming in. So Dipanjan, I hope you're ready. And we'll cover as many as we can in the short period of time that we've got left.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one here. So people will pay more for brands with memorable experiences. But surely the notion of value also comes in there?
It does. And in fact, I think a few slides on from the slide on price, we talked about the emotional clusters that matter. And I think value, if I recall correctly, was one of those. I do think, though, you have to understand that there's more to value than price. There are components of what it does for you, the time that it saves you, and so on and so forth. So it's probably better to think of value as a more complex creature than simply getting the best price that you can. That said, there is a viable price-driven competitive strategy. Now, I would counsel, though, for folks that do choose to adopt that price competition is a very scale-driven, cost-driven operational strategy. There is something very attractive about price premiums in that it goes directly to the bottom line of a company. If you have a volume strategy that is driven by cost, then essentially you have to cover the cost of all the transactions that result from the volume. So when you can sustain that inelasticity by having a higher price, it has a higher impact on value. So if all else is equal, you can create a relationship that sits on top of the value element, then you will have earned yourself that little buffer on price that will suit you very well in terms of your financial results. So yes, you can have a value-driven strategy, but as we know, in the world of customer relationships, a lot of that value comes from the nature of the relationship, the nature of the engagement, the kind of service that you provide, how open and accessible and honest and transparent and friendly you are as a brand. So I would roll in all of those elements into a value strategy rather than focus entirely on price, because what you will find is if you do everything else right, it will automatically lead you to a position where you can sustain a higher price. So it all comes down to how we define this notion of value.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I know that value is a big. It was always that big question mark. That was certainly a question that I asked when we were going through some of those slides around value. But as you nicely pointed out there as well, there's a lot more benefits that you can get when you create that emotional connection with your customers, beyond the value, beyond them wanting to pay more, but everything that leads to those business outcomes that we want to drive, which is purchase, loyalty, and advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of a brand like Southwest Airlines, that when it first started operations in Dallas, came under the bracket of sort of a low cost airline, with the idea being that it was all about sort of offering value. As it's evolved as a brand, the things that draw people to Southwest aren't necessarily price anymore. In fact, on any given day, they're probably at the same price point as the major airlines. But there are things about their service, their relationship, their transparency. For example, they had the whole transparency campaign, which was all about being honest with your customer. Those are the things that have remained as the glue in that relationship, right? So it sort of started off with this idea of value, but quickly expanded to being something much more rich.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic example. That really brings that to life. So let's move on. I think we covered this maybe a little bit when I asked a question at this part, but let me address it anyway. You found that feel is 1.5 times more likely to drive business outcomes. Was this a surprise? As the questioner asked, we've been talking about the importance of emotions for years. So did we really find this was a surprise?
It may come as a surprise to people who really spend their entire days wrapped up in sort of the features and the functionality of these products, right? And it is true that those things matter as well. I mean, there are sort of rational benefits that come into play. We just talked about value, which is sort of a rational benefit, often perceived emotionally. So all of these things do matter. But I think at the margin, when push comes to shove, the force that triggers the decision making is emotional, right? Again, these ideas are not disconnected. In all the brand strategy work that I have done, when we talk about emotional levers, we really talk about a laddered approach where a series of functional benefits and rational benefits ladder up to an emotion, right? I mean, we don't feel emotions in a vacuum. The reason that I am surprised or angered or dismayed is because you did a whole bunch of things, right? So I react to a whole bunch of attributes of a product and service, which then feeds my emotional state. So I really, again, being familiar with this literature and having sort of poked around in this space for a while, to me, it wasn't a surprise at all. And I think the entire discipline, as we talked about, has been moving in that direction and moving in that direction in a very sort of systematic and a scientific manner, right? So, we aren't in the world where we talk about emotions in terms of, cute puppies and Super Bowl ads and things like that. One of the areas, thriving areas in sort of new marketing is all about sort of neuroscience, right? And it's an extremely scientific take on how we feel, right? So again, no surprise to me. And what was reassuring is, I think, as we saw in the data, a lot of people may not be able to sort of describe it in the technicalities of sort of emotion and human infused branding, but they know that, hey, if you can understand how your customers think and feel, you're in a really great place to be able to, have an impact on them.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I'm going to just move to the last set of questions. There's two that are kind of similar. I see we are running up on time here. So let's just close out with this one. There's two here around big data. So the first was, did we expect the level of big data usage that we found? And then a follow-on is around what was the driver of big data usage, if we've got any answers to those.
Yeah, I was not surprised at all to see that level of usage. Someone asked Mallory once why he wanted to climb the Everest, and he said, because it's there. And I think that's a lot of what drives big data usage. It's there, and it's there in sort of copious volume. The data that we have, it doubles every year, right? And we use less than 0.5% of that data. There is such an abundance of data, and in some ways, it's almost easier, if you will, to collect and process this data. If you contrast this with what we are talking about in terms of small data, the kind of studies that you talked about, they are rich in insights, but they also take a little bit of time to do. You sort of need deliberate thought. You have to assign people to do it. It costs some money to do, right? On the other hand, you have sort of big data, and once you build an engine that works of itself, and it's an algorithm that keeps going without running out of steam, you can feed as much data as you want into it. Now, Letterbot, it may not be giving you something very useful, right? But in some sense, it's the path of least resistance. And I think companies fall victim to that. They're susceptible to sort of building this engine and this letting it run, as opposed to sometimes, really making the right investment to get the really valuable results.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I'm going to have to stop you there. We're literally up against time. Dipanjan, thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk with us today. I've certainly found it informative, very enjoyable. I hope everybody else on the line did as well. Thank you very much for all of our listeners who joined. If you've got other questions, please do follow up with myself, Zaid Dowling at focusvision.com. And I hope you will join us again for another webinar. So thank you very much, Dipanjan. Thank you very much, everybody. That's a wrap for today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.